Hello, LinkedIn Live. I am here with Dr. Tim Hodges. My name is Jim Collison. We want to welcome you to this LinkedIn Live. Hey, Tim, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Jim.
Glad to have you here. While we're waiting for folks to join us, usually takes a minute or two for folks to get the notification, log in, check in. As you're checking in, just let us know your top five. You can throw that right down there in chat. Or Riley behind the scenes, producer Riley, as we call her, will be behind the scenes, and we'll be putting those up on screen for us, as well as the question. How have you used your strengths in an interview? Like just maybe even without saying what they are. How have you tips and tricks? If you're thinking about that, you can put that in chat. We'll respond to that. Tim, you worked for Gallup in the past. I don't think you've interviewed for a job recently, but as you think about that for yourself, if you were interviewing today, how do you think you'd come to that question of getting asked those questions and using your strengths in an interview?
You know, I obviously with my experience at Gallup and my love for the CliftonStrengths assessment, I think the best advice I can give students is just to read through your top five report or read through some of those words. And there's just a different level of confidence we have when we're self-aware, and it doesn't come across as arrogance. It's authentic. And I think it's simple advice, but we often skip over it, even at Gallup and other places. Just, get familiar with who you are at your best and keep that top of mind.
Tim, do you think we'll talk about this here more in detail in just a second, but do you think it's smart to use the actual terms from the Clifton Strengths Assessment in the interview or try to just describe them?
Well, there's so much on the internet. I think you should do your homework first. If you're
Yeah.
applying for a job at Gallup, I would recommend you go ahead and be specific, because the hiring manager is probably going to know what they're talking about with those words. And if it's obvious to you that organization or that hiring manager, if that hiring manager lists their top five in their LinkedIn profile, then go there, and ask them questions about it. But I think you got to be self-aware. You can talk about your strengths without using the theme names. And I think sometimes that's less confusing.
If you're joining us, and you're hearing me, you're joining us. Thanks for coming out. Throw your top five in the chat down below. We'd love to see those. Many of you checking in and doing that. Again, the question is, as you have applied for a job, have you used your Clifton Strengths, and how have you used it in that process? Christina says there, I talk about my light side and dark side of my strengths when asked about strengths and weaknesses. An opportunity, I think, Tim, that's probably a question a lot of employers ask is, do you know what you're good at, and do you know where your weaknesses are? And I think you don't have to be afraid of either side of those, right? Because you've got some of that self-awareness and then a framework to talk about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when they ask about weaknesses, they're probably listening for a real weakness, not the whole, I'm too honest, or I work too hard, and you're just kind of dodging the question. I mean, we all have challenges in our lives, and own that. And I think that's freeing to the interviewer to realize you're telling them the truth and you own something, and you can talk about a weakness and also talk about how you're working to overcome that weakness. And we're all humans, and they're not hiring a robot, or they would just write an algorithm and hire a robot. They're hiring a human, so they expect you to have a weakness. Own it and roll with it.
No, right on. As you're listening and joining us, throw your top five there in chat. Many of you are doing that. Riley will be putting those on screen, and we appreciate it. Always great to have you out. I'm here with Dr. Tim Hodges. And Tim, let's take a second to get to know you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what you do now and a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, I'll give you my top five just out loud here as well. So I'm kind of scrolling the chat to see. I've got a couple themes in common with some of you: maximizer, relator, belief, woo, and positivity. So I'm about half as good as Jim, because we have about half the same top five, but we'll roll with that. So yeah, my job today is executive director of the CliftonStrengths Institute, which is housed at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln College of Business. Just this morning, I taught a room full of about 350 first-year students who take a required class to learn about their strengths and develop those during their time on campus. So I love what I get to do here. I also am a management professor in the College of Business. So that's my day job. Nights, weekends, and summer times, I still do some projects with Gallup, but started working at Gallup a little over 20 years ago, and had some great opportunities there to dig into this science about strengths and engagement and well-being, and had an opportunity real early in my career to spend a lot of time personally with Don Clifton. And I told some friends then I felt like I'd have to spend the rest of my career trying to pay back that investment Don made in me. And now I talk about him more than I talk about my own family. So I'm working on it, but love what I get to do.
Oh, that's great. That's great. The Tim, in the community that I manage, the number one question I get all the time around the resume is, do I include my top five on a resume? That just
Mhm.
is the standard question. Let's get started there.
Yeah.
What's advice do you give the students that you're working with or others thinking that same question?
Jim, I would include my top five on the resume because even if they're not, even if the hiring manager is not familiar with the terminology of Clifton Strengths, there are five words that are positive, and I think that's a way to get people to kind of see something that's right about you. And if they're not familiar with strengths, it may be something that stands out on a resume. And for any of you on the line that are hiring managers, you're looking for something that stands out on a resume because they all start to look the same. So I think it's great to list it. And then in your opening statement or in your interview, for sure, talk about what they actually mean. But I think it's a great idea to list them there. There's 28, 29 million people who know what those words mean. So you're probably going to be okay to put them on there.
Yeah, where would you list those right below your name? Would you put them as a footer on the bottom? Have you seen any best practices in some of the work that you've done there?
Yeah, my mine's probably a little biased because the interviews I've been involved in are at Gallup or at the Clifton Strengths Institute. So they're probably a little larger font and a little bolder on what I see. But I think it's good to list it under those attributes, or different formats have different sections. But I'd put it closer to the top. And then, you put some of those words out there, and then the hiring manager, as they look through your activities, might be subtly making some connections between, what is this competition or what is this deliberative? And then they might see some evidence of that. So I'd put it closer to the top. If it's a multi-page resume, which a lot of people say it shouldn't be, but if it is, then maybe put it in the footer or the header. But I'd probably put it closer to the top.
What do you say? Some people say if I'm that bold and I put those things out there, then I may get judged because I might deliberative or woo or
Hmm.
some of the positivity. I might get judged on those things. What do you say in that case to those individuals that may be afraid of that?
Yeah, I'd just say I've been judged for a lot worse things than my strengths. So they're going to do it anyway, right? But I mean, at most, maybe they'll be curious. And I don't know if that means judgmental. If you've got a theme that maybe isn't as socially desirable, because we all, if you say you have a lot of empathy, people think, oh, that's great. But if you say you have a lot of command, they might think, oh, what's that mean? So
Hmm.
some themes require a little more explanation. Realtor, they might think you used to sell houses. So you might need to explain it's not, realtor, it's relator, so you may need to clean up the language a little. But I think at most, I mean, again, it's a good conversation starter when you get to the hiring manager.
Some comments coming in from the chat room. Neil says, I used it recently in a sales pitch to some executives. 4 out of 7 knew about them. So,
Mm.
to your point, like chances are you're going to, maybe not everybody, but chances are you're going to run, you may run into somebody who does. Tim, how important then is it when we think about if you're going to include them on a resume, what kind of tools or resources do you advise on knowing them? So,
Mhm.
right, we've got some reports and some of those kinds of things that are out there, but how important is that to actually then know what each one of those means?
Yeah, I think it's really important for you personally to understand what they mean and to talk about them in your own words. You don't have to memorize Gallup's definition. The first assignment I do in my class with business students at the university is I have them they take the assessment, download the report, and highlight or underline the words or phrases that most resonate with them. So memorize your words, not just Gallup's words. Get familiar with it,
Mhm.
but I think it's good to put the theme in your own language, because otherwise you get into that point in the answer where you forget your next line and it's really awkward. So it should be a conversation, not a regurgitation. So I think it's good to own it and then say what it means to you.
With the students, do you have them work with each other on that, practicing that vernacular, practicing those terms, getting comfortable with it in a way where it just becomes a part of what I say then?
You were reading ahead in the syllabus, Jim. Good job. Yeah. So week one, we have them kind of internalize it and decide what resonates with them. This week, in week two of the semester, we have them share their report with someone who knows them well, and then we give them about 7 questions to answer or ask that person and say, to kind of see what stands out with them. It's a good chance for affirmation, maybe to challenge or question, hey, what does this mean? Or I've never seen that in you. Maybe you're that way at school, and I just know you at home, or whatever. And then we also build in, and the best, I do the lecture, but the best part of the class is the one-on-one coaching. Anybody on the call here who's had a one-on-one coaching session knows that the genius of strengths is that Don Clifton is the genius of strengths and used to say development happens best in response to another person. And so while the assessment's really informative, the development really happens when you unpack it with someone, particularly if that person knows what they're talking about. So we in week 3 and week 7 of the semester, all of our students go through a coaching session with an upper class student who we've invested in and developed, and it's amazing. In fact, Riley's one of our alums of the coach programs. We've even got one on the call here who's probably done 100 one-on-one coaching sessions during our time on campus. So that's when the real development happens.
Producer Riley behind the scenes, making sure we're taken care of, and also the one posting your top 5. If you want to continue to put those in the chat, we'll post them.
Always be nice to the person with the dump button, Jim.
That's right. That's right. I never speak ill about Riley because she could cut me off in just a second. So
he's going to mute you now.
Always, always appreciate that. Tim, so we've talked about the actual resume, and then we've talked about the knowing the structure, but how do I then bring that together in the conversation that I'm having with that person that's in front of me? How do I bring that in, or what are some tips and tricks thinking about that conversation that I'm having with that person that may be strengths based?
I think the best thing to do is get to know the role, get to know what they're looking for. And you can usually do that by doing a web search, reading the job description, not just the posting for the ad, but go shop the store, go walk into the building, as a customer, go, call somebody and ask them a couple questions. So get familiar with their culture. And if I'm the hiring manager, what I'm listening for is not, are you an interesting, good person? That'd be great if you were. But what I'm really listening for is, how could you use the best of who you are in this job? So if it's a sales job, don't give every answer as the time when you were a manager in this. I mean, think about how to apply your strengths in the context of what they're probably looking for. I mean, be authentic, be real, but be relevant too. The interview, your answer to the same question should be slightly different depending on who you're interviewing with and what job you're applying for. And both answers can be true. It's just which one's more relevant to the situation.
Mm. Tim, oftentimes we think the interview is over after we've gotten the job, and yet we know from our work together that we're constantly in a state of interviewing, right? We're constantly with the folks that we work with, and the team building that we're doing, and maybe the team changing in the last in the last 2 years. In most workplaces, almost 50% or more of the employees have turned over.
Yeah.
Right. So you have new employees coming in, you may have stayed or you might be going, but let's say you've stayed. These new employees are coming in, how do you think you could, as you're interviewing them, I'm going to put interviewing in quote, right? We say that's onboarding. How can that be used in that context to build teams then as we get all these new workers in?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost 100% that you're going to have different themes than the person you manage or than your closest teammate. So it's good to if you got some in common, great. But let's figure out what you have and what I have and how we're going to work together to make this work. So let's say, I mean, some of the best managers I've had in my life have analytical as one of their top 5. It's not one of my top 5. It's not one of my top 10. I don't lead with a lot of analytical, but if I know my manager does, what if I send them some notes before the meeting that they can review and think about ahead of time? Where if I have a manager who leads with a lot of adaptability or something where they're more in the moment, maybe that's not as relevant. So I think it's just key to understand, what do I have? What do you have? And how can we partner together? I mean, if both of us are exactly alike, one of us probably isn't necessary, right? So we'd probably each have something we can bring to the situation and something we each do best. So yeah, good question. Yeah.
When I'm spending time with my manager and we're having some of these conversations, how much do you think that's like the interview process? Just you're interviewing later on in the role. I mean, can you apply some of those same interview principles to some of the coaching conversations, hopefully, that you're having with your manager?
Absolutely. And let's not pretend that the interview goes one way or the relationship between a manager and employee goes one way. I mean, we're seeing now employees have a lot of leverage in the employee-employer relationship right now. So everybody's hiring. If you quit your job right now, you could probably have 3 offers by the end of the day if you just stop in every building on the way home. So, there's a lot of leverage there. So the manager is interviewing the employee, but it goes the other way around as well. That employee is looking for reasons to stay or not all the time. So yeah, I think that conversation needs to be two-way, not in interviews. Oftentimes it becomes a manager interviewing the the prospective employee, the applicant, and it's really a one-way thing. But the more conversational, the better, especially as you get into your career.
Let's flip the script for a second as we think about managers now interviewing individuals, thinking about if they get the opportunity to see someone's top five in their
Mhm.
resume. What kind of things should they be thinking about? How should they be approaching that top five of the individual they're interviewing?
My favorite word is curious. I think they
Mm,
should be curious. I think they should wonder, how might you use your themes in this role? It's silly to me when hiring managers build these wild simulations, or they'll have somebody, interrupt the meeting or spill coffee on you or something just to see how you'll react at your worst. Create an environment where people are usually at their best, and then create an interview process that puts people at ease when they're at their best. So yeah, I think it's good to set the employee up, or the applicant up, for success, to help them be comfortable. And then it's more of a conversation as if they were already a colleague, because that's really what you're
mhm.
interviewing them for. You're not trying to see how they react when the fire alarm goes off. I mean, we all need to know how to do that, but you can train them that later.
Tim, we want to remind folks that if they want to ask us questions, it'd be great. Just put them in the chat. If you could put a cue by the questions so we can see them a little easier, that's helpful. Tim, in your role there at UNL, you onboard, I think, more than 100 coaches every single year, right, to work with these. Is that
We,
number accurate?
we have 80 coaches each
Okay.
semester. I have 800 students, and there's a 10-to-1 ratio. We have some returning coaches, but we definitely train between 40 and 50 new coaches each year. So it's a good room.
What have you learned about the interview process with them? Because you get a whole bunch of folks who apply for that. You have to interview them. What kind of things have you learned about the interview process there that might be helpful for
Well,
individuals?
well, I'll just tell you what we look for. And if one of our potential applicants is listening to this LinkedIn Live, they get the answers, and bonus points for them for being curious,
I
right?
was afraid of that. Actually, when I
Now,
thought of that question, I was like, are we giving away the store? But
hey, if they're curious enough to log into something like this, they get a fast pass to the final interview. So, no, we have them actually record an interview, or a video of themselves for about a minute, and basically just ask them, why do you want to be a strengths coach? And the people who want to be a coach say things like they're curious, they're interested in the growth of other people, they had a good experience with their coach, and they want to pay it forward, or they want to create that for other new students. So those are the kind of things. Now, it is a paid position on campus. It does look good on your resume. There's other things that sometimes people will mention, but the people we're really looking for are curious. They're invested in others. They're not doing it for their own ego or whatever. And again, all those resume builders and great work experiences, that all happens anyway. But if that's their motivation coming in, there's other opportunities for them on campus. We tend to get about 150 or so applicants, and we only need about 35 to 40. So we have the opportunity to be a little bit selective, and that's ultimately what we're looking for.
yeah, that's the hardest part of the job, right?
Yeah.
Is narrowing those down. It's so hard when you met the students
Yeah.
and they're all great, right? And making
Especially
those
when my
decisions.
number eight's includer. So I wish we could hire them all, and maybe someday we'll need to, but right now we do sort. I have maximizer number one, so I can sort.
Yeah, you do pretty well at that. If the biggest question I get is, should I include strengths on my resume? The second one I get, and this is kind of specific to our strengths community, is what do you say to people who want to use strengths to hire? In other words,
Yeah.
you have to have a certain set of themes, or I'm not going to hire you. Certainly, when you're interviewing these coaches, you're not taking that approach. But what do you say to that, Tim?
Yeah, I spent a long time as a researcher at Gallup, and I would say that it's a poor decision if you're trying to hire somebody based on them having a specific theme. First of all, because it's not validated as a selection tool. That's not the purpose. It's about development. But the second reason is it's it's almost impossible to find someone who is going to have the themes you're looking for, because the theme combinations are so rare, and there's so many different possible permutations of top five. I mean, it's 278,256. So I'm sitting in Lincoln, Nebraska. I may be the only person in Lincoln, Nebraska who has maximizer, relator, belief, woo, and positivity in their top five. So if I say, wow, I think I'm pretty great, I want to hire somebody who's got at least three of my top five, I may need 100 applicants before I'd find someone with three of my top five, and they may not be a good fit for the job. So I think it's okay to have someone complete the assessment as part of the interview process. as long as you promise not to look for certain themes. But if you use that information as a hiring manager to ask better questions and to dig in a little bit deeper and to communicate about, hey, here's the theme I have, here's the theme you have. How do you think that would work together? That I think is okay and can be valuable. But if you try and select based on particular themes, I think it's a wrong approach.
Kathleen, thanks for that question. We spend a lot of time talking. There are some. It's simple and so well. It's simple to put together if you're going to do it that way. Difficult to implement and not what it was intended for. Craig makes an interesting comment. He says people use different talents to be great at the same job. As you think about hiring those 80 coaches, what's the variance in their top five, and how does that work then when you put them together as a team?
They're all across the board. So somebody might say, well, I think developers must be great coaches. We've got some people who have developer high and they are great coaches, but we've got some people who don't have developer high who are also great coaches. So we are less about what themes do you have in the interview process and more about how can you use this theme in your role as a coach. And that's true in any role in life. I mean, you can use your themes in anything. Go to, if I zoom into my background here, you'll see about 20 books from Gallup, and they all have a code in there. Some of them are for salespeople, and some are for managers, and some are for parents, and some are for pastors. And in every one, there's a whole 100-page appendix in the back that tells you how you can use your themes to be successful in that role of being a parent or a pastor or a salesperson. So, I mean, I think you can apply any one of your themes to being a coach. We talked too about how do you coach around certain themes. Maybe I'm going to coach somebody who's got restorative and I've got maximizer. They're not opposites, but it's rare to see them in the same person. So I need to think about what questions should I ask to draw them out rather than kind of forcing my framework of how I see the world on them. So if you're a hiring manager, ask, and you know what your applicants' themes are, ask them questions that help draw out their own themes. Don't just push your themes as a manager on them. I think it's more fruitful to draw them out.
Yeah, that's really good advice. We have about 5 minutes left here. If you have some questions, throw them in the chat. Put a Q in front so we can find them fairly easy. Tim, as we think about our weaknesses, things that get in the way of productivity, and that as your coach is the group that you manage there, how do you teach them to work with their weaknesses?
Well, the first thing we do is help them understand that the CliftonStrengths assessment isn't great at identifying what your weaknesses are. Even in the language, and those of you have your full 34 report, you'll remember it's dominant themes, and then there's supporting themes, and then the bottom themes we just call lesser talents. So that doesn't mean they're a weakness. They're only a weakness if you waste a lot of time trying to fix it. But there are situations you're put in where you need to know how to manage through this. So let's say, I have woo as one of my top five. My wife does not. She does not love to be in environments where there's a lot of new people and all that. Friday night, we had a mixer for faculty and staff, and she came along and she knew going into that setting, she would need to use some other talents because she's more introverted. Her default setting is not to go to a social event, but she was more charming than I was all night long. So you just got to figure out what do you have that you could use that can help you get through that situation. And that doesn't mean you have to love going to social events, but sometimes you're going to have to do it anyway. So what could you use instead?
How much value do you think it gives us, but knowing like, hey, there's some things I may trip over if put in this situation, and
Mhm.
then being able to say, but this is how I overcome them. How valuable is that, do you think, in
Yeah.
speeding up the success process?
That's huge. I mean, so sometimes people will say, well, I turn in my assignment late, but I don't have responsibility as one of my top five, or so I don't follow through on commitments very well. Well, you're about to get to take this class again next semester or change your major because you got to get to the outcome somehow, right? So
Right.
again, what not having a strength is not an excuse for being late or sloppy or rude. Or I mean, if you're late or sloppy or rude, figure that out,
Mm,
but get some feedback from people and then get better. But a lot of times a weakness is a lack of a knowledge or a skill or maybe just not enough experience in a particular area. You just need to get a few more reps. So I think in the interview process, it's good to own that and say, one thing that I don't really look forward to is whatever. But here's how I've done it before, and here's how I overcome that. And I think that you say yes to a different question, and they'll accept that.
yeah. Sometimes we talk about those blind spots, and the blind spot's only there until you recognize it as a blind spot. Now I know in my
Mm.
car, it's got some spots I can't see, but because I know that, there's tricks I can do to
Mhm.
get around that, to acknowledge it. I think the power of it is lessened as we acknowledge what it is,
Yeah.
and then say. And I think Craig had just said he uses his number 4 individual. I love this statement. Use
Yeah.
my 4 individualization and 6 learner to substitute for woo. And I
Yeah.
love that. I love that awareness. Right? Anything you'd add to that?
Well, with your car analogy, I mean, I think I've heard it said that the best predictor of future performance is past success. So in an interview, be sure you talk about when you've done something and done it well. But when you think about a car, there's a rear view mirror, but it's a fraction of the size of the front windshield. So spend some time talking about what you've done and what you've been, but really focus on what's possible out in front of you and why you think you'd be a
Yeah.
great fit for the job. You don't have to sell it real hard. Just paint a picture of what's possible and they'll catch on. Everybody else is just going to read their resume to them. So you can stand out if you just talk about here's who I am and here's what I think you're looking for. And I think this would be great. Be excited about the opportunity too. Don't be nervous. Just act as if you want to work with the person.
Yeah, you be excited, be interested, right? That I think
Yeah.
is oftentimes, and I think to use your own words, be curious in that
Mhm.
interview conversation. Ask questions. I've
Yeah.
spent a lot of time hiring IT students here at Gallup. I've probably hired a couple hundred in my days, and I like the ones that were curious. I would ask them,
Mhm.
"What questions do you have?" And I
Yeah.
always liked it when they asked me a bunch of questions. Tim,
Yeah.
in the final minutes that we have here, what other advice? What have I missed?
Mhm.
What kind of advice would you give through the interview process? And by the way, I think that interview process goes into the job. But
Mhm.
what other advice would you give?
Well, for hiring managers, I would say it definitely is the start of a process. And I mean, we've written a lot about it at Gallup about the employee life cycle, but it's about attracting and selecting and then onboarding. But you're still recruiting through the onboarding process. I've consulted a lot with school districts and other organizations where they think they've got a position filled, and then that person doesn't show up on the first day of work or the first day of school. You've got to keep them warm throughout the process. Maybe you're interviewing now for a job that doesn't start until 3 months from now. Check in with them every week or month at least, in between now and then, and tell them how excited you are to see them and all of that. So I think that for hiring managers, recruit all the way through the finish line, and then it becomes a retention. It just parlays itself right into retention. So I think that's pretty key for the applicants. And Jim, you just touched on this. I was thinking about how I might want to close our time, and be curious, but that goes both ways. If as a consultant, if I walk in a room and I just try and wow people with how much I know, some of them are going to think I'm interesting and knowledgeable and all that, and that's fine. But if I go in there and ask a bunch of great questions, they're going to think I'm a genius and I didn't bring any new content or new information. I'm just curious and ask them a few good questions. Most people kind of know what they're looking for, and you get them to talk that through. So if you're an applicant going into a job interview, you better have 3 or 4 great questions to ask that hiring manager, because most likely they're going to say, "Hey, do you have any questions for me?" And if you're like, "No, I think it's okay," or if you say, "Well, how many days do I have to come in the office?" or you get into transactional stuff, that can be a pretty quick turnoff to the hiring manager. So ask something about that manager. Ask them to talk about what's the best employee you have like. Give me an example of what success looks like in the role, and then they're closing on a positive note, and it's not that kind of awkward thud at the end of an interview where you're asking when you're going to hear back or how much does it pay or whatever. You can do all that on email later. So that'd be my advice.
And I'd add to that, have those questions practiced. Like
Yeah.
ask somebody else those questions. Just say, "Hey, let me practice with these,"
Yeah.
so that they just kind of flow. One final question, Tim. Not every student has access to a Strengths Institute like we have at UNL. We've
Yeah.
got a lot of great institutions around the world that are using Strengths, but
Mhm.
for a student who's struggling in that, maybe at an institution where they don't have it, what kind of tools would be available to them, maybe online or available in
Yeah.
one of our books?
It's almost like you're the host of a podcast that's got, hundreds of thousands of views and millions of views. There's so much content that's out there already, and most of it's true, especially the stuff that says it was produced by Gallup. So go online. There's so much out there. You don't have to take the CliftonStrengths assessment, although it's only a few dollars to do that. It's probably worth it. But even if you don't do that, go to the library. You don't even have to buy the book. Just go check it out of the library and read through it and get familiar with that language and that mindset of strengths. I think that can really move you forward. But
Mm.
there's so much available online that the Gallup and other organizations, I mean, other coaches and certified coaches have produced that's really good stuff to help you dig in more to your own themes. And it's great if you can hire a coach and get ready for the interview process, but just have a few conversations for the price of a cup of coffee. Everybody's got a friend that would sit down and, have a conversation, and that can prepare you for an interview. Cause I think we're at our best. An interview is like a great conversation.
Yeah, no, right on. I think we'll wrap it with that. Don't go anywhere though, Tim. Thanks for coming on and being a part of the program here. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.
Just a reminder, we zip these up and throw them into the brand new Clifton Strengths podcast. So if you haven't subscribed to that on your favorite podcast app, just go out to the app and search Clifton Strengths. We try to not make it too difficult for you. Sign up for that, subscribe to it, and you'll get interviews like this plus plenty others, including a whole season of well-being and Clifton Strengths. So we've got those resources that, Tim, for folks, again, that's available for them to listen to. We want to thank you for joining us today. Thanks for coming out. Always appreciate you and appreciate your questions. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.